Go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy to get 20% off your first month of cognitive behavioural therapy, with weekly sessions online with a therapist, in addition to worksheets, a journal, meditation and yoga videos, and unlimited messaging. There's strong evidence that CBT can help people who hoard, and accessing therapy online can be affordable and accessible. Find out more and get your discount at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/online therapy.
A lot can happen in 3 years, like a chatbot may be your new best friend. But what won't change? Needing health insurance. United Healthcare Tri-Term Medical Plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage that lasts nearly 3 years in some states. Learn more at uh1.com.
Think of all the sleep hacks you've ever heard. You could spend years trying them all, or you could instantly transform your sleep with Boll & Branch. They make the softest, most breathable bedding you'll ever feel. And it's all 20% off. That's their best sale of the entire season. Millions of sleepers love their buttery soft sheets, airy blankets, cloud-like duvets, and so much more. And you can try all of them for 20% off with promo code BUTTERY20. So hurry to bollandbranch.com today. That's BOLL and branch.com. See site for details.
Since 2013, Bombas has donated over 100 million socks, underwear, and T-shirts to those facing homelessness. If we counted those on air, this ad would last over 1,157 days. But if we counted the time it takes to make a donation possible, it would take just a few clicks. Because every time you make a purchase, Bombas donates an item to someone who needs it.
Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's bombas.com/ACAST, code ACAST.
Welcome to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder podcast. I am drowning in stuff and trying to find a way out. Listen as I explore the issues and delve deep as somebody profoundly affected by hoarding disorder. Find out more, including links to subscribe to the podcast, at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk, and find the links there to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and all over the place. So I'm going to start today by reading out a couple of the reviews I've received. I appreciate every single one of them, and if you too would like to leave a review on whichever platform you listen, that would help so much. It helps me, it helps other people find the podcast, and 5 stars is the best, obviously. So that would be amazing. So the first one I'm going to read today came from Heather, and she left it on Facebook. She said, "This is such a fantastic podcast. I appreciate the compassion, humour, reflection, the topics and proactive outlook. The presentation is so well organised and so helpful. It's just so refreshing to hear representation by someone who experiences the disorder rather than being the passive subject of others' scrutiny and analysis. This podcast is exactly the kind of dialogue that is needed to destigmatise hoarding disorder." Thank you, Heather. That is absolutely one of my goals with it, to help to destigmatise it, and I'm really glad that's coming across, so thank you. And the second review I'm going to read today came from Solo Sibling on Apple Podcasts, and they left 5 stars and said, "Saving my life. I have inherited sentimental clutter on top of all my own clutter. At this moment I have 2 dining tables in my dining room and 2 kitchen tables just a room away. Yes, with chairs. So much more. Your wisdom and encouragement is truly saving my life." Thank you so much. Feedback like this is saving me, honestly. This is such hard work, and it can be so disheartening, and it's just brilliant to hear from people, to hear that the podcast is helping people. That's always the goal, isn't it? So thank you. So I am here with Dr Jan Eppingstall, who regular listeners will be getting familiar with. She is a therapist in Australia who specialises in working with people who hoard And having studied hoarding for years, she is really insightful about what this problem is about and what can help. Most hoarders need some degree of professional help if they're going to get through this problem. But the number of therapies available is overwhelming and bewildering. So today we're going to talk about some of the types of therapy on offer for hoarding disorder. Jan specializes in acceptance and commitment therapy, so we'll be talking about that. We're also going to talk about EMDR, which is growing in popularity to treat people with PTSD. In my own experience, I've had various types of counselling and therapy, but the therapy I had specifically to help with my hoarding behaviours was CBT. So that is what we're going to talk about first. So a lot of the research that has been done into talking therapies for hoarding disorder has been done on cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. So whereas that often suggests that that means that CBT is effective, it may just mean that it's the most studied. So can you start by explaining what CBT is and how it can help people?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me back. I think CBT, I think you're right there. Aaron Beck developed CBT in the 1960s for use with depression. And since then, tailored manualized treatment protocols have been developed pretty much for every single psychopathology in the DSM. So they're all individual and beyond all these and all sorts of other things that people have just made up and said, yes, CBT will work. I mean, it's a client-centered, problem-focused therapy. Goals of treatment are discussed. You have concrete, observable kind of outcomes agreed between you and the therapist and the client. And case formulations, kind of, you would have experienced that when you went through it, is kind of a way for the therapist to identify some of those core beliefs that underlie the misconceptions and associated automatic thoughts, in order to try and intervene and replace them with rational thoughts. This is radio, so you can't see me doing this. Air quotes, but yeah, rational thoughts. And that's cognitive reappraisal, and that's not a nice word for, I don't know what. But so there are 4 steps that are kind of part of the process. Identifying those irrational thoughts, challenging them, testing the validity of the thoughts as well, and then substituting irrational thoughts and then eliciting feedback. So it's kind of this process of finding what's irrational and then challenging it, basically. So that's sort of the classic CBT. And it really is it's really only about your thoughts, the classic Beckian kind of CBT.
So as you know, I've had CBT for this, and that was because it was what was on offer rather than because I made a positive choice that was what I wanted. I was really skeptical when I went into it, but I was pleasantly surprised in some ways. I found it very helpful for certain things, like challenging my immediate thoughts, automatic thoughts. If I say I can't do it, I learned to it sounds really simple, but I learned to say, why can't you do it? And, break that down and see what was going on. And it also did help me to understand and challenge where some of my reasoning is skewed. I have to keep this because, and then look at that. Do I really? And so it was less surface level and less sticking plaster than I had thought it would be. But I would say it's a very specific approach that works for specific aspects of hoarding disorder rather than the whole thing. So what would you say the benefits and drawbacks are?
Yeah, look, I think just touching on the benefits and talking about how you sort of, how you mentioned it being, or you thought it might have been sort of a Band-Aid kind of type treatment. I think the reason it's often considered that by some is because it's not particularly deep. It doesn't require digging deeply into the past. Problems are in the present and solutions can be found without kind of investigating the client's deepest, darkest history. So, and I think that comes back to the fact that Beck, up until Aaron Beck, who's only recently passed away in his 90s, in the 60s, came up with this concept of CBT. The Freudian psychoanalytic school dominated. So the therapist was this blank slate for the client to project their problems onto and their thoughts and subconscious, and sessions were often 3 times a week on the couch, the classic Freudian session. And clients were kind of encouraged to recount dreams and fantasies and narrate their experiences and stuff so that the therapist could then uncover those deeper psychological themes. And it was costly. Some people were in therapy most of their lives. And sometimes it wasn't in the client's best interest. So if anyone has listened to the Shrink Next Door podcast, if you haven't, go and check it out. But they'll know the potential dangers of these types of enmeshed kind of therapeutic relationships when the client is unethical and even exploitative. But when Beck came along with CBT, it was a treatment that was relatively short-term. It was problem-focused, and it was, most importantly, systematic and manualised. So effects could be measured and assessed using statistics, regardless of the therapist that delivered the treatment. That was almost, they were almost just like a robot in a way. So it was a game changer, it's like, that's how it got so popular. And its popularity was then fueled by the research, which in turn led to it being prescribed by healthcare systems around the world. And it's prescribed for a good reason. Governments feel it's a good reason because randomised controlled trials are the gold standard for in medical circles. And that demonstrates its effectiveness. And because the medical model is used to describe mental health, it's a logical choice. We'll pick this one that has all of this evidence to support it. And governments don't like uncertainty. So, CBT's got the tick. But in terms of CBT for hoarding, for my thesis, I actually reviewed the treatment efficacy studies of all of the CBT for hoarding that had been done. And I found that there was only 2 true randomised controlled trials that had been conducted. In total, there was 13 studies of various methodologies and delivery methods, group, self-help, all this sort of stuff, individual. And they were conducted on a total of 394 participants. So that's not
loads.
That many. Yeah. 11 of the studies and 78% of those participants were from a single tri-state area in the east of the US, surrounding the particular universities of the key researchers at the time. One study was done in Melbourne, Australia, which I'm proud of, and I actually studied at that university. I didn't do the study, but I studied there. And 2 were conducted in San Diego, the US. So that kind of gives you an outline of what was done. 1 in 3 participants who completed the treatment, CBT for hoarding, achieved clinically significant change, which is to say they're no longer displaying clinical level symptoms of the disorder. So 1 in 3. And it appears that it works for a few younger treatment-seeking women who are able to complete more sessions and have more in-home organising help, while also receiving some psychopharmacological therapy. And we know that treatment studies are notoriously gender biased towards women. They're racially biased, and participants are seeking treatment. So they're willing, they're wanting to
motivated,
do this. They're motivated, and they're there, and they're going to complete it, and they're going to go every session. And when you look at the results of the psychotherapy randomized controlled trials, you've got to remember that the protocol has been followed to the letter. So the order of things are identical. There's no changes made for individuals. So in essence, the treatment works, again, air quotes, for about 1/3 of those who engaged in the studies. And I'm not saying CBT is good or bad. It's just important to recognise the limitations of the measurement of the efficacy treatment. And for something that is newly defined as hoarding, it's not like depression or anxiety where there's been thousands of studies and thousands of people involved. So I think the drawbacks for CBT for hoarding, the few studies that have been conducted have shown that there's no significant progress made after the treatment is over. So the hoard kind of remains stable.
Yeah.
It seems to me, and this is a personal view, that the treatment doesn't seem to make fundamental changes to the person's underlying beliefs unless it's constantly reinforced. So that's kind of, there's been very few follow-up studies, 1 or 2, I think. So it's very hard to say, and they're only 6 months, 12 months after. But people aren't going to all of a sudden start doing it again 2 years later, are they? I mean, the 6 months to 12 months seems to make sense. But there are also some, what we call in the biz, treatment inhibitors. So those are the things that are part of the profile of hoarders that make CBT less effective. One of those is comorbidity, especially if there's personality disorders, because personality disorders are extremely difficult to treat. Poor insight is one that's massive.
Yeah.
It could be, hopefully I'll get this pronunciation right, anosognosia, which is the lack of awareness of the concern or the consequences of your actions, which is basically is basically delusional, there's no problem. Or it might be an overvalued ideation, these things are worth as much as I believe they are. And it can also just be plain defensiveness. So the poor insight might come from one of those 3 areas. The other problem is cognitive function. Compromised cognitive function, because you're attempting to work with cognitive, we're looking at thoughts and planning and behaviours and decision making, and perhaps the person just doesn't have the capacity for that. My answer to that is it's possibly trauma, and we need to look at the trauma. But if we look at cognitive reappraisal, essentially, the essential kind of process of that reappraisal, it's much less effective in hoarding because it's based on this intolerance for cognitive dissonance. So that's the feeling of discomfort with 2 cognitions, when 2 cognitions are incompatible with one another. Like, I know the door's locked, that's a fact. I know that if I stop checking, nothing bad will happen, but I still have to keep doing my checking ritual.
Yeah.
So that's what we call an ego dystonic disorder. We know it doesn't make sense, but we can't stop doing it. We feel uncomfortable with those 2 opposing thoughts. But for disorders like hoarding, there's not that irrationality in the mind of the person. It's more of an ego syntonic disorder. Hoarding makes sense. Wastefulness is bad. Self-reliance is good. Saving is good. There's no battle of cognitions or discomfort with these ideas. Yeah, and so it makes sense. It's not irrational. I mean, the volume's irrational, potentially, or whatever, but
completely,
the actual thought process, and so you're trying to get that person to grapple with it, and then all you do is end up arguing with them.
If somebody thinks they're being frugal by buying 12 bottles of shampoo when it's on offer, it's hard to argue against that. Because they kind of are, but in a dysfunctional way.
Exactly. And so it just doesn't seem to be the right kind of process of change for a disorder like hoarding. So that, and there's nothing harmful about doing CBT for hoarding. I mean, it might be a little bit uncomfortable for the therapist working with the individual, because there won't be many gains if the person is really struggling with this idea of irrationality. But when someone has good insight and they're able to kind of connect the dots between, you know, oh, this is my behavior and this is where I want to go, then it is worthwhile pursuing, I think. But the thing about CBT is that it's not always pure CBT. So even if you're looking at, if we're really looking at the particular types of interventions, say with CBT for hoarding, there's a bunch of stuff that's in there. You know, you've got motivational interviewing, you've got acceptance and commitment therapy, you've got, you know, so it encompasses a lot of stuff.
Yeah. I remember years ago, I read a book by a psychiatrist called Ben Goldacre. I think it was called Bad Science.
Oh, yes.
And it was fascinating. As somebody who's not a scientist, it was very accessible, I thought. And it was all about clinical studies and how they should be done and how they're done badly, but also how to recognize by reading. I came out of this book able to read a clinical study and have some idea of whether it was reputable or not. And one of the things that he warned about was if a new drug, for instance, is being advertised as a cure for everything, then that was something to be suspicious about. If it cured headaches and period pain and infected toenails, then you had to be suspicious. And I think that's part of why I was suspicious of CBT, because as you said, it's prescribed for everything mental health, but also it's prescribed for IBS. There was a proposal to have CBT therapists in job centres here, like social security places, to help people get jobs. And I think that was part of why I thought one thing surely can't fix all of these things. And that made me suspicious of all of it.
And that's that medical model too. That's the other thing, is we're looking at it from a medical perspective, and we're saying, well, how can this prescription possibly treat everything? And that's part of the problem, because mental health isn't the same. You know, it really isn't. We don't have a drug that's going to cure anything. You know, we don't know of anything that is curable in the mental world. So that's very interesting though. And I do love that idea of, you know, the public being able to access that type of book that can give you a rough idea about what you're reading, because it's only going to improve your decision making when you want to go on a new drug or read about a new, you know, process or procedure. I think that's really important work.
I have endometriosis, which is a period pain from hell disorder. And I read a brief thing, you know, there's like, there'll be a paragraph in a magazine saying a new herb has been discovered. Anyway, I read something like that there was a new alternative treatment for endometriosis. And I'm not big on alternative treatments, but equally there are no regular treatments for endometriosis that actually do anything. So I was kind of, you know, it hurts a lot. And so you get desperate when you're in pain. So I looked up this herb and it was incredibly expensive. And I think I just finished Bad Science. So I emailed the people who made this drug and said, it says it treats endometriosis. Do you have any clinical studies? And I got a quick reply saying, yep, clinical study attached. And it did that thing. This herb, I can't remember what it was, would apparently treat everything you could think that could be a problem. And so I was immediately suspicious. And so I didn't spend it was a lot of money, which is why I looked into it. If it had been £5 for a bottle, I'd have given it a try. But, But because of what I'd learned from that book, I know this is getting slightly off topic now, but I'll link to the book in the show notes because it really is a fascinating look at, and so I decided not to invest in this thing because I didn't trust it, because if they had tested it against every disease known to humanity and it worked, then there was something going on.
The placebo effect is real, people.
Isn't it just?
And there's nothing actually wrong with that, I guess, because if it works, if the placebo effect works, but there's a lot of people out there who will spend an awful lot of money and encourage other people to spend an awful lot of money. And if, you're slightly more skeptical than the other person, chances are the placebo effect is not going to work. It's a whole messy. I don't know about in the UK, but in Australia, they can say they've done studies with with like herbal remedies and things like that, and they haven't. I mean, they haven't followed any protocols or procedures or followed any of the rules. So they can say that, but it doesn't actually mean they've done it. When the reality is, I gave one to my mum and she felt better. There we are. Exactly. Yeah. We found a few people who were in the office and we offered them up a couple of pills, and it was great. It's like, I mean, no. But it's good that you went through that process and contacted them, and I think that's really important for people to ask questions and be in control of their treatment in every sense. Yeah. So the therapy you specialise in is acceptance and commitment therapy. Can you tell us a bit about that and how it works? Sure. Well, I was initially attracted to acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT as it's known, because it resonated with me so profoundly. Like Russ Harris describes ACT as the process of accepting what is outside of your personal control and committing to action that improves and enriches your life. I actually highly recommend his book, The Happiness Trap. The second edition has just been released. It's a very accessible read, so maybe we can put that in the show notes. But it helped me ACT helped me see things differently in my own life. And I had kind of a fundamental change in my perspective and the way I dealt with personal experiences. And what resonated with me so much was the idea that struggling with psychological pain and attempting to change it from bad to good was not only impossible, but it was also making my suffering worse. And I guess what acceptance and commitment therapy taught me was psychological pain is not only normal, but it's worth engaging with curiously. And I use that word curiously a lot, but that helps a lot with your mental health, being curious. Psychological pain's not a problem to be solved. You can't deliberately get rid of it. And in fact, the more you try to shut it out, the more it becomes your focus and causes suffering. So having that goal of getting rid of anxiety or depression is just impossible. Happiness isn't the default state or the default human state. We're wired to spot danger and we're biased towards negativity, full stop. So happiness is not, not everybody is happy all the time. We have all these various emotions and we need to feel those. And also, this was a big one for me, much of the worry I had related to either the past or the future. And problem solving the worries wasn't going to work. So that was kind of like, an Oprah aha moment. Like, wow, this is really I'm getting this, I'm really liking it. And the other reason I found it so empowering was the focus on values and action and not just cognition. So when I work with clients, I ask them to contemplate what, their deeply held core values are. Because this can help them see what needs to change in their lives, and so that they can live according to those values. And like I said before, we don't like cognitive dissonance. So, if we say cultivating strong family relationships is a core value, but we live in a hoarded environment and we can't cook or have a family meal and eat together at the dining table, I mean, there's a clear mismatch between where you are and where what you value. But one of the things that a lot of people don't realise, and I didn't really realise at the time, but ACT is actually part of the CBT family. So, mind blown. It's not like a separate sort of, it has both cognitive and behavioural elements.
Yeah.
It's just based on a slightly different philosophical lens, and it's more behaviour driven than classic CBT. But one of the key differences between ACT and CBT is the idea that thoughts can be changed. That there's some way of stopping our internal troll from beating us up. Really, I can't say that CBT actually says that you can change your thoughts at the source, but the idea is that with time you can reassess thoughts and find a more rational way of talking to yourself, and it becomes more of a habit. It doesn't actually say you can change your thoughts, but one thing we do know is that attempting to suppress our thoughts actually makes us think about them even more. So how many times have you thought about a white rabbit in the last few days? None?
None until right then.
So, over the next few minutes, try really, really hard not to think about a white rabbit. Are you thinking about one?
I am thinking about a white rabbit.
To check whether you're thinking about it, you have to think about it, right? So It's the same with emotions as well. It's not only thoughts, but, like trying to ignore your irritating child who's asking, for a lollipop incessantly. It just increases if you're trying to ignore it, it just increases the irritability, and then you snap. So, actually feeling it or being with it rather than trying to ignore it is going to help move through it. But ACT kind of has this really big sort of backstory, like it has this big philosophical basis that is, it talks about the development of the human brain and language, and that's particularly strong with ACT. It's something that they have done so much research on. But language is what makes thinking and planning and evaluating and comparisons possible. And they kind of wanted to work out, what's thought all about and how does it impact us. And I mean, language really advanced, of course, our civilization, and we're able to apply our verbal skills to our internal mental processes. And when we do that, we're reminded of negative consequences. So I join you tonight on this podcast, and I think I better not F this up, I better not feel anxious. I might stuff it up. So thoughts of failure, are going to elicit anxiety. And then I imagine humiliating myself on this podcast, and my anxiety rises even further. And then I'm in this vicious cycle. And, that might even escalate into a panic attack. And it's that way of thought and visualization that actually makes us feel like we're in danger, and then it escalates the spiral. So what ACT attempts to do is, accept that thinking the thought is fine, but not hooking yourself to that thought or fusing with it and believing it's like capital T true. And the way you do that is you might say, I'm thinking the thought that I'd better not get anxious. Or imagine the words are up on a big billboard or a TV screen, or they're leaves floating down the stream. It's a way of kind of separating yourself and seeing those thoughts as just thoughts, just words, not connected to anything. And that's the idea where acceptance comes from. Accepting that thoughts are just words and they can't control us, they can't make us become anxious. But if we do attach ourselves to them, they can. And one of the most effective techniques described in the CBT for hoarding protocol is something called thought listing. I don't know if you've come across that, but it's actually an ACT technique, not a CBT technique. What you do is you kind of vocalize the thoughts running through your head as you're deciding over possessions. And once they're out there, you can kind of distance yourself from them. You know, you can turn them around and look at them rather than from them.
Yeah.
And this is a process known as diffusion in ACT. And it's this thought, it's this kind of distancing and thought listing that's actually been shown to decrease both the behavioural and the emotional symptoms of hoarding. So both reduced saving and reduced attachment to possession. So it's doing both things. It's helping the person, see that is not the capital T truth. So I think ACT is there's so much to ACT, and I could probably talk for the rest of my life about ACT. But it is about that. One of the core things is that there are these core processes that lead to psychopathology and equally lead to psychological health. So it's like they're kind of universal.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to you because I listened to a lot of talks that were released as podcasts from a Buddhist organization in Australia, actually, called, I think, the Buddhist Society of Western Australia, but I will link to them in the show notes as well. They have like a regular Friday night talk by one of the monks or nuns and release it as a podcast. And I'm not a Buddhist, but I think a lot of the teachings make sense. So I find it interesting from a kind of ethical point of view and that kind of thing. Anyway, one of the Buddhist teachings is that pain is not suffering. It's wanting to not be in pain that is suffering. And that took a bit of mental work to get my head around. But actually, once I'd heard it, it's true. I would have, endometriosis, prime example. My period would be killing me. I couldn't stand up. I couldn't, and I would think this is suffering because I hate it and I want it to stop. And then I would go, oh no, maybe that's the suffering bit. And it's really interesting and a useful way to reframe things, I think.
Totally. And ACT kind of has a lot of, it's not Buddhism, but it has a lot of those aspects to it because there is just fundamentally something that makes sense about it. And I think that's what clicked so much with me when I first read about it. And I was going, wow, okay, yes, I can actually see how these things, and that was one of the things, psychological pain is not the same as suffering, and that exactly. But yeah, the Buddhist thing that they're quite clear about saying, look, we're not any it's not religious, but it's not any, Buddhism isn't really even a religion, is it? It's a philosophy.
There's a debate that rages on.
There's a debate that rages on. Exactly. there is types of Buddhism that are religious, but then there's this whole ethos. But it does have a number of those kind of underpinnings.
Yeah. The other thing that came to mind when you were talking was I started having panic attacks when I was a child, had no idea they were panic attacks, but I can recognize them now as that. Had them throughout my adult life. And while I don't never have them now, they're vastly reduced. And that was because of, I would have, I think like many people, a whole process that my body and mind would go through to ultimately create a panic attack. And I would start from, I feel a bit sick. What's that about? And then I would go, well, obviously it means you're going to be sick. Are you going to be sick in front of everybody? And my thoughts would, whatever had triggered it, or it might be my heart's beating a bit fast. Am I ill? What's happening? And I would go through this process, which meant that half an hour later, I would be in full panic.
Yeah.
And what really made the shift from daily panic attacks to occasional panic attacks was to start, instead of going, oh no, my heart's beating faster. Oh no, I've gone cold. Oh no, now I've gone hot. Oh no, this is awful. This is awful. I would change it to, oh, that's interesting. I've gone really hot. And, oh, look, your heart's beating a bit faster. That's, interesting. So rather than, it's that curiosity thing, rather than this is awful, because in itself, going hot isn't awful. You're just going hot. It's everything your head does with it that makes it awful. I remember a life-changing thing for me was learning that physiologically, anxiety and excitement are exactly the same. The only difference is what your brain does with it. And that started this shift that ultimately got me to the place where I could mostly control my panic attacks. Because on its own, your heart beating a bit faster is just your heart beating a bit faster. It's what your brain does with it that turns it into something that's ominous.
Exactly. Everything you just said is like gold. That is just gold. It is just like, yes, everything that you just put together there is what this is about. And that curiosity and going, oh, that's interesting. Oh, looking at it rather than from, oh, okay, now my heart's beating a bit fast. Wonder why. That is gold, because that is going to separate you out from what your thoughts are, the path that your thoughts are taking you down.
Yeah.
In fact, Stephen Hayes, who's one of the developers of ACT, he had crippling anxiety attacks, and that's where all of this kind of came from. Because he thought, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going to turn around and face it. I'm going to turn around and face the lion or the tiger or whatever it is. I'm not going to keep saying it's awful and it's horrible and run away from it. I'm going to look straight at it. And, he's in his 70s now. So, and he hasn't had a panic attack for probably 30 or 40 years.
The ones that still get me tend to be the ones that creep up on me because I haven't noticed the early stages. So by the time I notice it's happening, I'm in full blown, this is terrible.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And hopefully if you kind of catch it, chances are you're not going to, not going to embarrass yourself, because a lot of it's about embarrassing yourself. I don't want people to see me, having a panic attack. And
and that can be another of the thoughts, can't it? I bet people are noticing. I bet people are looking at me and thinking she looks weird. And and
chances are, no, everybody's only worried about themselves.
They are also in Tesco doing their own shopping and don't care.
Exactly.
Hey everyone, I'm Craig Robinson, co-host of the Ways to Win podcast, alongside my good friend John Calipari. I've been on the go recently. Phoenix, Kansas City, Chicago. If you're like me and have a home but aren't always at home, you have an Airbnb. Hosting your home or a spare room is a very practical side hustle. If you live in a big game town, you can Airbnb your place for fans to stay in. Your home might be worth more than you think. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host.
Cool fact, a crocodile can't stick out its tongue. Also, you can get health insurance for a month or just under a year in some states. United Healthcare short-term insurance plans, underwritten by Golden Rule Insurance Company, offer flexible, budget-friendly coverage for you. Learn more at uh1.com.
So, EMDR is the third therapy we're looking at today. It is increasingly used to treat people who've experienced trauma. I think a lot of people hadn't heard of it a few years ago and perhaps have now. So, as we know from the first time you came on the podcast, an awful lot of hoarders have a trauma history. Lots of people are skeptical about EMDR because it does seem a bit woo and a bit like crystals, that kind of thing. But there is a decent amount of evidence for its use. So how would you explain EMDR for a start?
Okay, well, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR, it really has gained momentum in the trauma treatment space, and the World Health Organization is now recommending it for therapy for children and adults with PTSD. So it's kind of got their tick of approval. I don't do EMDR, but from what I understand, it's kind of like a standardized procedure that begins much like other types of therapies. So psychoeducation, mapping out of the client's symptoms, what sort of support systems they have in place, resources, self-regulation skills. So you're really trying to get a whole picture of the individual. And then an overview of the client's traumatic memories, like say on a timeline, is made out, and then one specific traumatic memory is selected. So the client summarizes the particular event and then is asked to select the worst image from the event and report why it's still so disturbing to them. And I guess the woo-woo piece comes in when the client's instructed to concentrate on the disturbing image from the memory, think about their negative belief and feel the distress in their body while simultaneously experiencing what they call a form of bilateral stimulation. So which is commonly in the form of repeated eye movements. And the client has to follow the clinician's finger moving from left to right in front of their eyes. So they have to follow the finger moving in front. So every 30 to 45 seconds, the clients, while this is happening, is asked to describe what they notice, the thoughts, sensations, and in their body and images and all that sort of thing. Now, the typical way this goes is that the sensations apparently get stronger, physical sensations get stronger after each set of 30 to 45 seconds. And then the client is instructed to keep concentrating until it naturally subsides. And afterwards, some clients report that the memory is like become very vague and distant, or they can't recall the details anymore. And if someone's experienced lots of traumatic events, if they've had one traumatic event, then it's okay. So they were in a car accident, for example, and they need treatment for that. That usually takes 1 or 2 sessions of 60 minutes a session. So for a single event, it's pretty effective from what the studies say.
Yeah.
If you've got lots of different types of traumatic experience, if you've got, say, complex PTSD, then you have to kind of you work on multiple memories. But the question is, how does it work? And we don't know.
Yeah.
They can't say why it works. Some research suggests that the finger movements don't do anything at all, and it's actually the reprocessing of the trauma that helps the client resolve the trauma. So especially those bodily sensations, because there's some theory that the trauma response is kind of trapped in the body, and that the energy hasn't been diffused from the nervous system, and it needs to kind of be revisited or reprocessed. I mean, I can't say I know of anyone who's had EMDR therapy, I don't think. So I can't make any definitive statements about its efficacy, but I think regardless, it's a bit like what we were talking about before. Whether it's the finger moving or not, the entire process does seem to help people process trauma. So whatever it is, it does seem to help a large number of people. And again, it costs an awful lot to become a EMDR therapist. So I may never find out. It's like thousands of dollars, I believe. So to become like a registered clinician, but it is you're working with a very vulnerable population and all that. I get it. But there is cognitive processing therapy, which is kind of like another form of CBT that does similar things. I don't know a lot about that, but a lot of it's about psychoeducation and accepting the fact that, the trauma wasn't your fault and, it's impacting your thoughts and beliefs. You need to, change your perspective. So that's another option for people with trauma. But I think EMDR has got some of the right kind of concepts behind it in terms of processing that trauma again. A lot of people are scared to do it because they feel like they will never be able, that the sensations will just keep going and going and going. So people can be very like you're talking about your panic attacks. People feel like oh gosh, I'll never stop. But we know that doesn't. We know rationally that doesn't happen.
Yeah. As I understand it, the origin story for EMDR is that the woman who invented it was feeling depressed and was walking through the park and was looking at the trees from alternate sides of the path and looking from left to right to left to right, and suddenly felt better and thought, oh, that's interesting. And so kind of tested it out a few times and repeatedly found that thinking about why she felt bad while looking from left to right somehow made her feel better. And so people started studying it. And yeah, as I understand it, nobody quite knows why it works, but it just does seem to.
Exactly. And is it because I just don't know. I just can't.
Yeah.
And maybe one day we'll work out that there's some connection in the brain to the memory and the emotion, and it somehow actually kind of integrates that. And maybe it does. Maybe that's exactly what it's doing, and we just need to maybe trust, because we look at all these other therapies and we say we've got all this evidence for them. But whether evidence is evidence. Yeah, I think it's really an interesting concept, and I'd love to be able to learn more about it. But as I say, I think the treatment becoming a treatment, a physician or whatever they call them, or a therapist, EMDR therapist, is quite a big undertaking, and it's very expensive.
So if somebody has experienced trauma and is a hoarder, they may seek out EMDR to help them deal with their trauma. Would that have any positive impact on their hoarding behaviour, would you say?
Well, it could, yeah. I mean, it could, in that if that trauma was leading them to slip into shutdown a lot and into turtle mode and not being able to cope, perhaps unlocking that trauma might actually allow them to manage that kind of step ladder of autonomic nervous system. But I think they'd have to do something else as well, because I don't think they're necessarily going to learn, the techniques with only EMDR. They probably need to learn more about, polyvagal, and even something like maybe some ACT to sort of assist them along the way with general mental health. But I do think it could unlock some things. It might integrate the brain better, and they might be able to, connect better with their frontal lobe and process and plan better. But I don't know, because we haven't done any studies.
That bit at the end of a dissertation that says kind of what still needs to be done. It's a long list.
Exactly. Yes.
Now, I'm sure this question could have an episode of its own, but if a hoarder is seeking any of these therapies, how do you choose a therapist?
Yes, the $64 million question. it's hard to select a therapist for everybody, and there's no way to be 100% certain. I mean, that people can behave one way, and then you get into a session and they're a completely different person. But, we have to kind of deal with that uncertainty. And I don't know about you, but in Australia, there's a massive shortage of trained psychologists.
Yeah.
And psychologists are the only ones who are able to get Medicare rebates, or you're able to get Medicare rebates with. So if you can find one and get an appointment, fantastic.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of that. It's like, take what's there. But, perhaps finding someone like me who's an expert in the area that you've got a problem with, but with a counselling qualification who doesn't get rebates, it might be worth going for someone like that who has more experience with your particular disorder. But I think first rely on your gut. I mean, do you initially feel safe with the person? And if you don't, there's no need to see them again. You don't have to keep going. And competence, secondly, how long have they been practicing? If they've been practicing for a very long time, they might not be across the latest research.
Yeah.
If they're just starting out and have some life experience behind them, they might be a great fit because their qualifications are more current. So you need to work out what you're looking for. And what exactly are those qualifications? Which professional organisations are they members of? Like peak bodies. In Australia, it's the APS for psychologists, it's the ACA and PACFA for counsellors. There's actually no mandatory registration for counsellors in Australia. So someone can call themselves a counsellor and not be part of an organisation. So that's something you want to know. That's not saying that someone who isn't capable, but it's just that whole, that person will have insurance and they'll have, all these other things.
I think here it's the same. I think I know you can't call yourself a psychologist, but I think you can call yourself a therapist, for instance.
Yes.
If you've read a book. And the benefit of a professional body as well, because I have a friend going through this, is there's somebody you can complain to if somebody behaves unethically.
Exactly. There's actually a code of ethics that's in black and white, and you can go to that body and you can complain. Now, if that person doesn't belong to any of those members, any of those organisations, buyer beware, which with your mental health in a vulnerable state is not something that you really want to mess with. So I would say check which memberships and go to the website and double check, do that due diligence. They might say they're a member, but they might not be. But I think just doing that little bit extra due diligence is good. And with the prevalence of trauma, that I see, you probably want to prioritise someone with training and experience working with those sorts of clients. Now, that's a bit tricky that, you might find someone who's a member of the ASTSS, which is the Australian Society of Trauma and Stress Studies or something like that. I'm a member of that one. Just looking for some membership to an association or some listings of some of the courses they've done and that type of thing would be useful. But finally, it's that connection. I mean, do you feel a sense of mutual understanding with this person? Do you feel like they kind of get you? And can you see this connection, working in the long term? Because you're in a very vulnerable position when you're telling people about yourself, your life, and you need to feel that comfort that, hey, I've got a connection, the person is safe, and I think that if I need recourse, I know where I can go. Those are the most important things, I think. And then after that, you've just got to find someone who's available, who has capacity to take you on.
If somebody finds somebody who has enough experience to make them comfortable, but like you say, they've not been doing it 60 years and haven't read a study since 1962, and you get on well and you have a good feeling, but they have no experience of specifically working with hoarders, would you say that's a barrier? Or
so hard because there's so few of us.
Yeah.
There's so few people who actually have any real idea on the kind of breadth of what hoarding is. But that's not to say that there aren't people out there with similar, experience with similar disorders. Maybe someone who does OCD work, or someone who, even eating disorders, things like that can kind of fit. Yeah. But it's someone who has some sort of an idea about addiction or behavioural problems or personality. Those types of people you're going to find probably have more tools in their toolbox. They'll be able to, get an idea of what's holding you back. I think the thing with hoarding that's the most difficult is that there often needs to be that physical assistance. Like there needs for many people, they need that kind of motivation in the room helping them. Now, that might not be cost effective for you to have your therapist like me. I mean, I do that quite a lot. I go to people's homes and I help them, and we work through the mental part, but we also do the physical. Yeah. I don't do much, but I'm there to sort of talk them through it. Now, that is where it gets a bit tricky. And if you can't find someone who will come to your home, I don't know. I think that's a bit of a maybe I'm being mean, but it's a bit of a red flag for me. If a therapist won't come to your home, if I think it's important for every therapist, to actually do a home visit, because I think there are a lot of things that you can connect when you've seen someone in their home environment. That may be completely, I may be blowing people's mind there with that one, but I think a visit to someone's home can really improve the connection. Not only that, it can improve the insight of your therapist. And if the person takes a long time to open up and allow that, fine. That is the person's that's their prerogative. They can take as long as they like.
So people shouldn't be put off by the thought that if they get a therapist, they'll be at their house the next week.
That's right. No, because I just don't. I just don't see that is helping. You can't softly so much. If the person's working with you, you can't step so softly that there's, that you're standing still. But, it does take time for a person to feel safe, and that's perfectly fine. But maybe someone with experience with addictions or OCD, behavioural type disorders is probably your next best, I would say.
Now, most of us think of therapy as a one-to-one relationship, but there are also options of family therapy or group therapy. Would you recommend either of those for hoarders?
Okay. Well, group therapy, group CBT for hoarding has been trialled, and from the meta-analysis, it seems it's just as effective as one-on-one sessions, as long as you've got some home visits included, because there actually is a protocol for groups. And some universities have groups that they've set up for this purpose so that they can do studies. And the feedback from that's been mixed, I must say. I mean, one of the problems with groups is that they have to be run by an experienced therapist who can manage the dynamics of the group. And what often happens in universities is that some young, graduate student who might not be respected by the group or have that kind of, knowledge and experience to manage it. So that's one thing I would say there. But, when you're working within the hoarding population, there are some personality types that don't suit group work. So selection is super important. And again, that might not be something that a really young person can kind of assess. Keeping members on track and focused can be really problematic in hoarding, as well as off-topic discussions. I've heard lots of stories about people having to use like a clock, almost like the talking stick, because often with hoarding, there's the tendency to kind of confabulate or just kind of really talk about all sorts of roundabout stuff, but not talking about the topic. So assertive facilitation is pretty important. I think most people I've spoken to, I've got quite a few clients who've been through the groups at the universities, etc., and they felt like it was a good start, and they felt validated because they were amongst fellow treasure hunters and they could relate, because it's very isolating. But overall, it wasn't really enough, and they weren't able to kind of translate the learnings in the session into discarding in the home. So they found it like it was great in meeting up, and the thing they loved the most often was having a cup of coffee with the group afterwards, at the cafe or whatever. And some of them continued on meeting as a group afterwards, but I don't know how that impacted their hoarding. I'm gonna leap in here and say it probably didn't help it that much. But having other people that you can connect with is really good. Family therapy is a tricky one. If you're working with a person who began hoarding like later in life, and they want to change and work on themselves and grow as a person, 1 or 2 family sessions may be appropriate. Like it might help the therapist see the dynamics, particularly having a family session in the home, and that can kind of instruct how they work with the client. But on the whole, I don't really recommend family therapy for parental hoarding because we know that in cases of abuse, talking to children in front of parents isn't giving you the true nature of the child's experience and familial dynamics. This situation is no different. Children of hoarders at any age need individual psychological support. Meeting with a family therapist to work on a parent's mental illness just isn't offering that to the child. It's just more energy and focus on the parent at the expense of the child. So no, I wouldn't recommend it in those cases. I also believe that trauma assessment of all members of the family are essential, and then each member should engage in treatment separately, particularly if it's a very difficult situation and you've got young children, or even with adult children of hoarders. It's an extremely traumatic way to grow up. And I think family therapy for the person who hoards is only going to turn more attention to that person. And, I don't know that that's really helpful for the dynamic of the family.
Yeah, that was my instinct, because my first thought was, well, say you have a parent who hoards and children who live at home in that hoard, then surely family therapy is good because they all need support. But then I thought, well, they all need support, but it doesn't have to all happen in the same room at the same time. And something I've learned through interviewing Elizabeth and through interactions with the Children of Hoarders group on Twitter and just reading and general listening and learning is that it absolutely is a trauma to grow up in a hoard. And that child does need support, as you say, whether they're still a child or whether they're an adult. But that trying to get that support in front of the parent who's causing the problem does not seem realistic at all. And what they need is somebody of their own who also, because I would imagine in a family therapy situation, a child who is already being traumatized by a parent, and I don't think that's overstating it, will be hyper alert to any indication that the therapist might be favoring the parent or justifying the parent's behavior or anything like that, because that's how they're growing up. And so they need somebody who they believe is actually on their side rather than neutral, I would say.
And even if the therapist is on the side of the child, you get home, what happens at home?
Yeah.
Then you bring up all you told her all those things that, are supposed to be a secret. And, it's very much, it's a very, very tricky space to navigate. And family therapy is one of the most difficult.
Yeah, I can't imagine.
I don't do family therapy, but I have a colleague who does. And she actually trains people now, but she is amazing. But there are very few people out there that have that skill.
Yeah.
And I can say that she would probably agree that it's not, with that type of family dynamic, it's just not appropriate. But I do think therapy is appropriate and support is appropriate for everybody, just not together.
Yeah, yeah. Now, it's been hard to ignore the multitude of ads, especially if you listen to podcasts over the last few years for online therapy services like BetterHelp. There are several. Would that be something you would recommend?
Yeah, look, I think there is some merit in something like BetterHelp and other kind of online therapy providers. And here's kind of why, because I think firstly, hoarding is really shameful and private. And if you live in a small town, you might not want to go and see a therapist about your hoarding problem. You don't want to go to see that local person who everyone knows and says hello to. So having someone who's completely neutral is going to benefit people in those situations. Then you've got sufferers of social anxiety, which often co-occurs with hoarding. They're often avoiding therapy altogether. But being able to live message or talk on the phone to a therapist would be great in that case as well. I mean, it's a money saver, especially if you're looking for weekly or more frequent sessions. It's going to be a lot cheaper for you than seeing a therapist. And being able to contact them when you need them. It might just be enough when you get overwhelmed. Just a quick boost of confidence could be validating. So there's benefits there. Of course, during the pandemic, we've struggled with face-to-face for so long and video conferencing has become the norm. So a lot more people are tending to feel more comfortable about it. And I'm not saying anything about the quality of something of a service like BetterHelp. I don't know. They say they're qualified therapists and all those things, but I'm just saying that there are some benefits worth considering with that type of delivery. I mean, even myself in the future, I intend to kind of offer those types of alternative communication methods for my clients to sort of supplement the face-to-face work, because I can see a merit in using technology to improve mental health. And there are many ways that can be done. And text messaging, etc., can be really effective.
Yeah, the CBT I had was during lockdown, so it was over video call. And obviously that would never happen in normal circumstances, but it was fine.
Yeah.
And even just like I could do it in the workday without having to drive somewhere and come back. And, so so that would take 2 hours instead of 1 hour. I could, just switch it on and switch it off again. One negative I found about it was that you don't have that psychological sense that you can leave the difficult stuff in the room and go home.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting observation. Yes.
So there's I think there is something about standing up and leaving a room after a difficult conversation. And instead you just click leave and then you're still in your bedroom or whatever.
Yes. Yeah. And maybe there's some ritual around that you can be encouraged to do. In fact, I was actually enrolled to do a course on telehealth, a graduate certificate on telehealth this year, and there wasn't enough people interested to do the course. So they have postponed it, which I was very disappointed about, because I was like, right, this is what everybody needs. There's very few people out there who actually have qualifications to deliver this type of therapy. People say, oh yes, I do it over Zoom, but there's lots of things that you can learn that make it much more powerful and much, even that type of thing, talking about how you end the session and how you deliver the session. All of that stuff is what I wanted to learn.
So finally, that I'm seeing local support groups for people with hoarding disorder popping up all over the place, which seems to me to be a real positive. Would somebody attend those in addition to therapy, would you say, or would it be instead of?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of support group, I'll say. I mean, support groups can be great because you meet with like-minded people, as we said before, and, you know, you're going to share your wins and your epic fails and all that sort of thing, but it depends on the group. And we all know there's often toxic people there that can turn a functioning support group into a nightmare. So that's always something that needs to be sort of thought about. A traditional sort of free-for-all support group is great to dabble in, but it's not going to be helpful as a treatment process. But if you've got more of a peer support group, which is run by someone who has lived experience with hoarding, and has a great deal of knowledge, a whole lot of lived experience that they can pass on, that may be a good place to start for someone. And again, this is this stepped care thing, I guess. But, there's lots of buried in treasures groups. And if there's any that have started in your area, I think go and check it out. If it's facilitated well, it might be, just that kind of kickstart that you need. I just think that if you've got a really good peer support facilitator, that can be all you need to really start moving in the right direction. And then you can think about where you want to go from there. But one of the pitfalls of any support group, be it online, like a Facebook group or a local meetup, is that it can be a time suck. We get so wrapped up with the relationships that we're creating online or in the group, and we forget about why we're actually there. I mean, most of us have done it. I've done it, spending hours, answering questions and supporting others on the Facebook group. And then, I flop into bed and I've done none of the work that I haven't created that course or done the things I was supposed to. So we started out doing it as a way to help ourselves and improve our lives by letting go of stuff, but it's turned into another way of avoiding dealing with that stuff. Yeah. And it does feel good to cheer others on, but it feels better, I think, to be the one being congratulated. I do see benefits for sure with, meeting up with other people, but yeah, you can forget why you're there.
Yeah.
Peer support groups, though, I do have high hopes that there will be more of those around, and that could even be like a funnel for people to come through in terms of stepped care and like, okay, I started here, this is how far I've got, now I need to go to the next level.
Yeah. And I think something I imagine would be a benefit, it's not something I've engaged in myself, but I would imagine just being with other people who do it, people who you might quite like, might be helpful in terms of combating some of the shame you feel about your situation. Because if you think, well, Jill is really nice and not a mess and not disgusting, and yet her house is like that, so maybe I'm all right and not a mess and not disgusting.
Exactly. And that's what the people I spoke with, the clients that I've got that have done those, they said, look, it was really great because I could sit there and listen to stories without feeling shamed about my circumstances. And I felt valid. I felt like I was, that I was with people that I could relate to. But a couple of them did say, if there's someone really strong in the group, if there's someone who's really opinionated or really loud or, very assertive, that just ruins the whole dynamic. And that's why I think if you've got a facilitator who really knows their stuff, they can pick those people out and say, look, you're really needing one-on-one counselling rather than group.
Yeah.
Because the other thing about group is that you can't quantify is the benefit of being with other people who are like you, that has that additional sort of impact on your mental health that often can't be really quantified. So for many people, it is the best way. For many people, that's something that they really get a lot out of, and other people are just, no, it's just not for me. But yeah, there's that additional kind of cream on the top that you get with group work that can't be achieved through one-on-one counselling, I think.
Yeah. Amazing. Jan, as ever, that was so informative and fab and helpful. And
Yay.
I suspect it will guide some people in the direction of therapy and in a more informed way. They might think, I'm going to look for an ACT therapist, or, CBT sounds ideal for the way I think, or, and that's brilliant. So thank you so much. If people want to find you online, where can they do so?
They can find me at stuffology.com.au. I'm also on Instagram at stuff_ology, or Twitter, same handle. You can find me on Facebook at Stuffology Consulting. And yeah, if you want to email me, just jan@stuffology.com.au. I love getting messages from people from anywhere. I don't mind.
And I will put all of those.
Thanks for having me again.
You are always welcome. I will put all those links in the show notes, but many thanks again.
See you next time.
In just 1 second, I'll give you my top tip of the week. In the meantime, please do subscribe to the podcast, review it, 5 stars would be amazing, and share it with your friends or anyone who might be interested or who might benefit from it. It all really helps. To find more ways to support the website, the podcast, and my overall de-hoarding project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. Now, back to your top tip. So my top tip this week is to regularly remind yourself of the progress you've made. Even if it feels tiny, every little win should be celebrated, or at least noted. Have a note in your phone where you can just add little successes, like 1 bag out today, 5 bags out yesterday. Or I'm wary of suggesting a notebook, because if you're like me, you have 800 of them and you lose them within minutes. But if notebooks work for you, then that. Maybe if you have a book with to-do lists in the front, you can have achievements in the back, something like that. But remind yourself of the progress you've made, because on hard days, you will need that as motivation to keep you going. Okay, thank you for listening, and I will speak to you next week. Thank you for listening to the Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. You can find more online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. You can find me on Twitter at @thathoarder and on Facebook at Overcome Compulsive Hoarding with That Hoarder. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support, and do subscribe to this podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes.